Hello, YouTubers out there. This is Jerry Saravia at the movies. So, we're talking briefly about Martin Scorsese, who did think that the original Star Wars back in 1977 was a wonderful film, as he put it. This is a direct quote from a book called Martin Scorsese, A Journey, written by Mary Pat Kelly. So, basically, a little historical background on this. In 1977, a week or so after New York, New York opened, which was a rather downbeat musical made by Martin Scorsese, or directed by Martin Scorsese, Star Wars opened. The first Star Wars, of course, A New Hope to the rest of you. And as he puts it, the whole industry went another way. It became megabucks. I'm not condemning it, and I'm not criticizing it either. Star Wars was a wonderful film. It started a whole new way of thinking and of looking at films. It's just that people became interested in something else entirely, and New York, New York looked hopelessly old-fashioned. So, the film New York, New York was a box office bomb, and Raging Bull, when it was released in 1980, was a box office bomb. King of Comedy, which, again, these are films by Martin Scorsese, released in 1983, was also a box office bomb. As a matter of fact, it was considered the biggest box office bomb of that year, 1983. King of Comedy opened in theaters for about a week and a half. This is according to Scorsese. I wouldn't remember this myself, although it was a film I was keenly aware of at the time, but I never saw it in a theater, and so it disappeared. So what's the point of all this? Well, this has everything to do, as far as background fodder, if you like, or insight into what Martin Scorsese thought of Marvel movies. Now, this really shouldn't be such a controversial issue, but apparently it was. Right around the time, as many of you know, that Scorsese's The Irishman was due in some theaters, but mostly opening in the streaming service Netflix. He was asked about Marvel movies, and he said, well, they're theme parks. They are not cinema. Then later he had to clarify this in a New York Times op-ed article. Talk about weird. As if Martin Scorsese has to defend Marvel's superhero movies. He would never make one. At the same time, he would never make a film like Star Wars. As a matter of fact, in the Future of the Movies, which was a series of 3 different interviews with Scorsese, George Lucas, and Steven Spielberg, the latter 2 being more populist than Scorsese ever could be. Spielberg was asked, well, do you think by the late Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, could Martin Scorsese make Close Encounters of the Third Kind, or something along those lines? And he said, well, he could maybe make a very interesting Close Encounters, but that's not his sensibility. And as we all know, there are certain directors that have a certain kind of sensibility. Martin Scorsese is basically from the streets. He knows things that happened on the streets. Violence, gangs. He had asthma. He mostly viewed the outside world from his bedroom window. So a lot of his insights came from that. He basically related very well to films like Force of Evil, film noir pictures at that time, where seeing a dead body in the street was not unlike what he might see in his own neighborhood. So he comes from a very different world. So the last thing anybody should really ask, I mean, there are so many questions that could still be asked, I think, because I've read many interviews with Martin Scorsese, being a huge fan of his. The last question anybody should ask him is, what do you think of the Marvel movies? As if that was the end, or a renaissance worth discussion for a director, one of the most personal that we've had, possibly since John Cassavetes, certainly Robert Altman. But the reason I bring that up is because Star Wars changed cinema. Now, not necessarily for the better. There are 2 ways to look at that. In 1977, the audience also changed. They wanted escapism. Marvel movies fall under that category. Nomadland would not fall under that category. Or films like Parasite, or, you can take your pick. and certainly not Martin Scorsese's pictures. I never really viewed any of his films as escapist entertainment. But that is the key, is to understand that his feeling on the movies now, with regards to superhero movies being the most popular, not just Marvel, but DC to a certain extent, but certainly the Marvel superhero movies, they take precedence over everything else. We know this because Ridley Scott's film The Last Duel, as some of you know, was a box office failure, and it didn't even get a chance in theaters because it was released only on one screen in certain theaters. And this is a movie with Matt Damon, Ben Affleck. It's a Ridley Scott picture. It is, a period piece to be sure, but it looks like it has action. This is the same guy who directed Gladiator, which became not just a box office bonanza, but also Best Picture of the year 2000. And it only gets, so when even he is getting sidelined with this type of film because of everything else that's populating the market, so to speak, then it only makes sense that someone like Scorsese would look at these movies as just theme parks. Superhero movies are not about people. Not really. They are about extraordinary superpowers. They are people technically, but they are, once they have the superpowers, they're no longer people anymore. Superman is not a regular human being. Certainly, issues, flaws do exist, but not to the extent that other types of films that are more reality bound, that is to say, real life, are conflicted with. It's just not the same, no matter how you look at it. It doesn't make them less cinematic. That I would, I do partially disagree with that because, again, there was Star Wars, which really is, these people don't have special superpowers except, maybe the Jedi have certain powers that are mystical and go beyond what most humans could ever achieve, to say the least. But that's really where all this comes from. That is the insight into this. That is where Scorsese's coming from. It's because of what happened back in 1977, and further cemented by Heaven's Gate in 1980, which derailed a studio, United Artists, and the idea of a personal film made by a studio with a director expressing a personal expression about themselves was gone, unless it was escapist entertainment. And we know that Spielberg and Lucas, obviously, with Star Wars and Indiana Jones and so on and so forth, I don't think it was their idea to say this is all that there should be, because we know Spielberg has certainly gone on to do many different types of films that don't necessarily deal with sharks or ETs or whip-wielding archaeologists. Knows that too. I think Spielberg's heart lies in other types of films about ordinary people, perhaps facing extraordinary circumstances, to say the least. But cinema changed, and this is where we are now. There is no special regard, unfortunately, for anything that is not necessarily about superheroes or reflects on superheroes or people with extraordinary powers, because most of it dominates not just movies, the Cineplex, or in fact it also it affects television. We see a lot of it on TV too. And so this is mostly what's out there. But the point being that regardless of his feelings on the matter, the truth is that we are where we are now with movies, because Star Wars was a big box office, a super phenomenon, unlike any other. If any of you had been alive in 1977, you would know. This movie was, kind of redefines the word ubiquitous. I mean, it was really everywhere. Everywhere. Not even 1989's Batman can approximate the type of phenomenon that Star Wars was. And for those of you who are alive in 1989, you know that summer of 1989 was all about Batman. The Tim Burton film, naturally, with Michael Keaton as Batman. So that's That's really that's the truth of the matter. It all goes down. It all goes back to Star Wars, and the fact that Scorsese liked that film doesn't change the fact that that's kind of shaped the next 40 years. For better or worse. I mean, it's not to say you don't have small personal films being made, but it takes usually 3 or 4 studios to make them. That's where we are today. A big Hollywood studio is not going to take the chance on a young director, an iconoclast like a Robert Altman, let's say, or even a Scorsese for that matter, and give them a $30-40 million budget even to make a smaller picture, because the studios don't want to do that. They don't even want to spend 30 or 40 million. They want to spend an excess of 2 to 300 million. Now, you don't need that to make a small, quirky drama. That's where we are today. That is all Scorsese is really saying. If the glut of cinema is permeated by only these types of movies, the bottom is eventually going to fall out. That is the more interesting statement, other than saying, that they're not cinema, comic book movies. So that's where we are now. And that's what I have to say on the subject. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe to my channel. And this is Jerry Saravia at the Movies, signing off.